Now, I don't want to talk too much about this article, as we've already gone into pesticides and other chemicals being in the water supply, but I did want to touch on this. So, acephate is a bug killer, and it's used on tomatoes, cranberries, Brussels sprouts, other fruits and vegetables, belongs to a class of compounds linked to autism and hyperactivity and reduced scores on intelligence tests in children. Now, I very much dislike the comparison here to just autism and ADHD. This pesticide was banned in the European Union more than 20 years ago, not because it produces effects that could result in autism or ADHD in children. That's not the point here. The point is that this is a pesticide that was banned 20 years ago, which is known to affect brain development. Linking it specifically to something like autism or ADHD is not useful, and it's also stigmatizing. But it does affect brain development of children and of adults in later, as they grow up. It can result in a number of different issues in the development of the brain. Humans are squishy sacks of meat. Our brains are also squishy sacks of meat with electricity running through it. It's very easy for chemicals in large doses to affect the development of the brain. And that's the key point here, is not what it can produce and the problems that may come from it. It's why are we using this chemical when we know for a fact that it alters brain development in a way that is not positive. That's the bottom line, is we don't need the whole it can cause this developmental issue or not. Because why is this chemical, which has been banned in the EU for 20 years, allowed to be used in growing the food that we eat when it affects brain development in any way that isn't positive? It's just that simple. Rather than banning the pesticide like the EU did 20 years ago, the US EPA recently proposed easing restrictions on acephate. The federal agency's assessment lays out a plan that would allow 10 times more acephate on food than is acceptable under current limits. So it's already acceptable under current limits, but no, we're going to allow 10 times more of it. The proposal was based in large part on the results of a new battery of tests that are performed on disembodied cells rather than whole lab animals. After exposing groups of cells to the pesticide, the agency found little to no evidence that acephate and a chemical created when it breaks down in the body harm the developing brain, according to August 2023 EPA document. They're moving ahead with this proposal. Now, a scientific advisory panel, I don't want to skip this, to create the new test designed to measure the impact of chemicals on the growing brain. The EPA worked with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which comprises some of the world's wealthiest democratic countries, and conducts research on economic, social, and scientific issues. The OECD has warned against using the test to conclude that the chemical does not interfere with the brain's development. So, the people that the EPA worked with to design these tests were saying, don't use these tests to make this conclusion. The scientific advisory panel the EPA consulted found that because of major limitations, the test may not be representative of many processes and mechanisms that could harm the development of the nervous system. California pesticide regulators have argued that the new tests are not yet reliable enough to discount results of older animal tests. The Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, a second group of advisors handpicked by the EPA, also warned against using results of non-animal tests to dismiss concerns. Every single group that the EPA has worked with to create these tests to come to this conclusion that acephate as a chemical does not have sufficient evidence to be linked to harming the brain development of children has said, don't do that. You can't use this test in this way. We don't recommend it. It's not correct, etc., etc. But on top of all of this, the EPA will just ignore these. And while this chemical is already legal and in our food supply in the United States, they want to allow 10 times more of this chemical to be used in food production as a pesticide. It's shameful. In response to questions from ProPublica, the EPA acknowledged that it will need to continually build scientific confidence in these new methods, but said that the introduction of non-animal tests to predict the danger chemicals pose to the developing brain has not been done in haste, rather a methodical, stepwise approach, and has been implemented over the course of more than a decade. Now, I actually agree with this bit. It is a methodical, step-by-step approach that's been implemented for more than a decade. These tests, which all non-EPA groups that the EPA has worked with in the development of these tests, say that they are not equipped to make these claims. These tests are not accurate enough to be able to make that prescription that these chemicals will not harm a developing brain. Now think about what this could mean for the rest of food industry regulation, for the rest of all of the things that we talked about. If these tests, which are non-animal tests in a lab, can conclude that acephate as a chemical does not have a negative effect on the development of a brain, when it does, objectively, based on decades of evidence, and is banned in the European Union for said reason, what else that we know is bad for you could be shown to not be bad for you? For example, how about that lead in the water supply? How about the cadmium or the mercury or the many different bacterias? This is a dishonest tool being developed by dishonest actors inside of this agency, and likely funded by corporate lobbying interests. As we know that many of these lobbyists do infiltrate agencies like the EPA. Let me pull up. It's no secret that the chemical industry holds undue influence over the regulatory process, and U.S. corporations wield an incredible amount of power. The Environmental Protection Agency is no exception in reviewing health care and environmental impacts, often relies on industry-funded studies, with this corporate science rarely available for public review. Rather, chemical companies commonly sit on panels of the committees that advise regulators. This is true. One of the most effective strategies used by big agriculture to sway regulators may be the revolving door in which former agrochemical industry executives, lawyers, and scientists serve in government agencies that are charged with overseeing the industries. This happened quite a bit during the Trump administration, and even before that, during the Obama administration and under the current Biden administration. Many of the people who sit on these panels in the EPA are former executives, are former scientists and former lawyers, former employees for the industries that they're meant to regulate. And then after they serve their time on the EPA, they move back into that industry and just continue to make more and more and more money from it. These directors have accepted university positions funded by Monsanto, Bayer, and Syngenta. Some of them have worked as attorneys for the industry, served as board members of agrochemical companies, and other EPA officials have left the agency to work directly for agricultural industries. Stephen Johnson, EPA Administrator and Assistant Administrator for the Office of Prevention, Pesticide, and Toxic Substances, joined the board of Scotts Miracle-Gro, which markets pesticide glyphosate in the U.S. Linda Fisher, Assistant EPA Administrator, moved on to work for Monsanto and DuPont. John Todhunter, Assistant EPA Administrator in charge of pesticides, went on to become a pesticide consultant. Bill Jordan, Deputy Director of the Pesticide Office, now a consultant for pesticide companies. Stephen Jelinek, former Assistant Administrator for Toxic Substances, founded a consulting firm that would eventually employ many other former employees of the Pesticide Office and represented Monsanto, Dow, FMC, Chemical Manufacturers Association, among other agrochemical companies. It's very clear that none of this study, none of the information that's produced in here, the new tests are a methodical, stepwise approach that has been implemented over the course of a decade. This is the only true part of this article. Not this article, but these claims made by the EPA. ProPublica has done great work in acquiring these articles. This one doesn't matter. But the only truth that comes from this claim of the EPA is that for decades they have spent much time and money placing officials from different companies, different corporations, Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta, the ones that we just went over, continue to serve on the board of the EPA or for private consulting agencies that work with the EPA to produce these bogus studies so that the regulation of these industries is weakened even further than it already is.